The security guard's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You're not allowed in here." Michael Grant pulled his daughter Sophie's hand back, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. The pristine marble lobby of Harrington Industries gleamed under bright lights, making him acutely aware of his worn work boots and the grease stain on his jacket he'd missed that morning. Sophie looked up, her 7-year-old eyes glistening with tears, but her chin held high. "It's okay, Daddy, we can leave." Michael squeezed his daughter's small hand, swallowing the lump in his throat. The words from this tiny person hit harder than any drill sergeant's barked orders ever had during his Navy days. Her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation made his chest ache. "Yes, sweetie, let's go," he whispered, turning toward the revolving glass doors, his lean figure slightly stooped, as if carrying an invisible weight. The click of expensive heels against marble echoed through the lobby, stopping directly behind them. "Wait!" The voice rang out sharp, but with an unmistakable tremor beneath its authority. Michael turned Sophie, still clutching his hand, to see a young woman stepping out of the crystal elevator at the far end of the lobby. Her tailored Navy suit probably cost more than his monthly rent, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. Tired but intense, as if she'd been fighting battles he couldn't see. "No one has to leave," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the security guard, who suddenly found the floor fascinating. "I'm Eleanor Harrington. What seems to be the problem?" The security guard straightened his tie. As Harrington, this gentleman was attempting to access the legal department without an appointment. Company policy clearly states, "I'm well aware of company policy," Eleanor cut him off, her attention shifting to Michael and Sophie. "But I'm also aware that sometimes policies need context." She looked directly at Sophie, her expression softening slightly. "And sometimes we need to remember why those policies exist in the first place." Michael felt his daughter's grip tighten on his hand. They hadn't expected to encounter anyone from the Harrington family, especially not the young CEO, whose picture occasionally appeared in business magazines. This changed everything, or nothing at all, depending on how the next few minutes played out. "Why would a Harrington care about people like us?" Michael's voice came out harder than intended, the bitterness of the past 6 months evident in every syllable. "Your family's company has already destroyed our lives. What more do you want?" Eleanor didn't flinch at his tone, but something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. She glanced at the document folder tucked under Michael's arm, then at Sophie's school backpack covered in faded stickers of sea creatures. "I'd like to hear why you're here," she said simply. "Not in the lobby, properly." She gestured toward the elevator. "Please follow me." The security guard stepped forward. "Miss Harrington, I must advise against." "Thank you for your concern, James. That will be all." Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Michael hesitated, weighing his options. They'd already been turned away twice this week, each time by increasingly hostile gatekeepers. This might be their only chance to file their complaint directly. Still walking into the lion's den with his daughter felt reckless. "Sophie stays with me," he stated firmly. Eleanor nodded, "Of course." As they rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, Michael felt Sophie press against his leg, her eyes wide as she watched the numbers climb higher than she could count. The silence hung heavy between the adults, broken only by the soft hum of the elevator's ascent. Michael's mind raced through the journey that had brought them to this moment. 10 years as a mechanical engineer in the Navy had taught him discipline, precision, and how to identify problems before they became catastrophes. Skills that served him well until they didn't. Until life delivered a catastrophe no amount of preventive maintenance could have avoided. Lisa's cancer diagnosis had come without warning. Stage 4. 6 months later, she was gone, leaving Michael with a 5-year-old daughter in a grief so profound it physically hurt to breathe. He'd left the Navy immediately, unable to reconcile deployment schedules with raising Sophie alone. His engineering background had landed him a decent position with an environmental consulting firm where he discovered his knack for water purification systems. He'd even patented a small-scale filtration design that showed promise. Then Sophie started getting sick, repeatedly, along with dozens of other children from her elementary school. Tests revealed elevated levels of toxic compounds in their systems that matched the signature of industrial waste from the Harrington plant that loomed over their small town. The school closed temporarily. Medical bills mounted. Michael's employer, dependent on contracts with Harrington's subsidiaries, made it clear his investigation into the matter wasn't appreciated. The choice became stark: drop it or lose his job. He chose Sophie, always Sophie. That meant taking the night shift at The very Harrington factory he suspected of poisoning his daughter, the only position that offered the flexibility to care for her and the health insurance they desperately needed. It also gave him access he'd been using for 6 months to meticulously document every environmental violation, every shortcut, every falsified report. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime revealing an executive floor that might as well have been on another planet compared to the factory floor where Michael spent his nights. Eleanor led them down a hallway lined with abstract art pieces that probably cost more than his annual salary into a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Please have a seat," she offered, gesturing to the leather chairs surrounding an imposing mahogany table. "Would you like anything, water, coffee? Something for your daughter?" Michael shook his head as he helped Sophie into a chair. "We're fine." Eleanor settled across from them, her posture perfect, but her fingers betraying nervous energy as they tapped against her leather portfolio. "I've just returned from our Asian operations tour this morning. I apologize if there have been difficulties in reaching the appropriate channels." Michael couldn't hold back the harsh laugh that escaped his throat. "Difficulties? Is that what you call having security escort us out twice? Or your legal department refusing to even accept documentation of illegal toxic dumping? Or maybe you mean the way your plant manager threatened my job when I asked about the chemicals turning up in our drinking water." "Dad?" Sophie whispered, tugging at his sleeve. The gentle reminder to mind his tone cut through his anger like nothing else could. Eleanor's expression remained carefully controlled, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I wasn't aware of any of this. Please explain exactly why you're here." Michael pulled a thick folder from his bag and slid it across the table. 6 months of evidence. Water samples, soil tests, medical reports from 37 children, including Sophie. Internal memos showing your environmental compliance officer raised concerns that were repeatedly ignored. Maintenance logs with deferred repairs to containment systems, all pointing to the same conclusion: Harrington Industries is illegally dumping carcinogenic waste into Miller's Creek, which feeds directly into the water table beneath Oakwood Elementary School. Eleanor opened the folder, her practiced composure slipping as she flipped through the pages. Michael couldn't tell if her surprise was genuine or merely the reaction of someone caught red-handed. "This is," she began, pausing as she studied a particularly damning lab report. "Criminal," Michael finished for her. "The kind of criminal that gives children chronic respiratory conditions and puts them at risk for cancer. The kind your PR team can't spin away with press releases about corporate responsibility." Sophie, seemingly oblivious to the tension, had pulled out her sketchbook and crayons. Her small fingers worked meticulously on a drawing while the adults spoke. Eleanor looked up from the documents, her expression unreadable. "Why bring this directly to headquarters? There are regulatory agencies, lawyers. All channels your company has significant influence over," Michael interrupted. "The EPA office responsible for our region is headed by a former Harrington VP. The top environmental law firm in the state counts your corporation as their biggest client. Even our local officials back away when your company name comes up. So yes, we came directly to the source." Sophie nudged her father gently, holding up her completed drawing. It showed a river in bright blue with children playing alongside it. Trees and flowers bloomed on the banks. The sun smiled down from a corner of the page. "It's what the creek used to look like," she explained, her voice small but clear, "before it started smelling bad and making everybody sick." Michael watched as Eleanor took the drawing, her manicured fingers careful not to crease the paper. Something shifted in her expression as she studied the childish artwork, a crack in the corporate armor he hadn't expected to see. "Sometimes the most valuable gift isn't something money can buy, but something given from a pure heart," she murmured almost to herself. The words hung in the air, strangely vulnerable, coming from someone whose family name adorned half the buildings in the city. For a brief moment, Michael glimpsed something beyond the CEO persona, perhaps the person she might have been in a different life. Eleanor carefully set the drawing aside and returned to the folder, examining the documentation with newfound intensity. "These dates. This shows the increased contamination began approximately 18 months ago." Michael nodded. "Coinciding with the production expansion under Robert Harrington's new manufacturing initiative, the one that magically increased output by 22% while reducing operational costs." Something flickered across Eleanor's face at the mention of Robert's name. Her cousin, if Michael remembered correctly from news articles. The man who ran the production division with an iron fist and a notorious disregard for anything that slowed efficiency. "I need time to verify this information," Eleanor finally said, closing the folder. But you have my word that I will personally investigate these allegations. Michael couldn't suppress his skeptical expression. Your word? Forgive me if the Harrington word doesn't carry much weight in my community these days. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Grant, Michael Grant. Mr. Grant, I can't undo whatever has already happened, but I can promise you this will not be buried. Not on my watch. She pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back before sliding it across the table. My direct line, not my assistant, not a secretary, me. If you don't hear from me within 48 hours, call it. Michael picked up the card, surprised to see a personal cell number handwritten on the back. He tucked it into his pocket without comment. Sophie needs to get back for her afternoon medications, he said, standing and helping his daughter gather her drawing supplies. Those breathing treatments don't administer themselves. The statement landed exactly as intended, a reminder of the real human cost behind corporate spreadsheets and efficiency metrics. Eleanor walked them back to the elevator herself, ignoring the curious glances from employees watching the unusual scene of their CEO personally escorting a factory worker and a child through the executive floor. As the elevator doors opened, Sophie turned to Eleanor and held out her drawing. You can keep it. Maybe it will help you remember. Eleanor accepted the artwork with visible surprise. Thank you, Sophie. I will keep it somewhere I can see it every day. The doors closed on her expression, leaving Michael and Sophie to descend alone. Sophie leaned against her father's side, suddenly tired after the emotional encounter. Do you think she'll really help us, Daddy? Michael stroked his daughter's hair, choosing his words carefully. I don't know, sweetheart. Rich people's promises are often written in sand, while poor people's pain is carved in stone. Back in her office, Eleanor Harrington sat at her desk, staring at Sophie's drawing. The childish artwork seemed jarringly out of place amidst the sleek modernism of her workspace, yet somehow more authentic than anything else in the room. She pulled up the company database on her computer, searching for information about the Oakwood contamination issues. Nothing appeared in the official reports. Frowning, she dug deeper, accessing the production division's internal systems, a privilege few at the company possessed, even among executives. After an hour of searching, she found a buried report labeled Minor Operational Issues, Oakwood Facility, categorized as resolved, and signed off by Robert himself. Opening the file revealed a sanitized summary that mentioned temporary containment challenges that had been addressed through procedural modifications. No mention of ongoing contamination, no reference to health impacts, certainly nothing about a closed elementary school. Eleanor's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a mistake or an oversight. This was deliberate concealment. She glanced at her grandfather's leather-bound notebook tucked in her desk drawer. Harrison Harrington had built this company from nothing, guided by principles he'd documented in meticulous handwriting. Principles she'd promised to uphold when she took over as CEO last year, the youngest in the company's history and the first woman. She hadn't opened the notebook in months. The pace of global operations board demands and quarterly targets had left little time for reflection on her grandfather's old-fashioned business philosophy. With hesitant fingers, she pulled it out, the leather cool against her skin. The pages fell open to a passage she'd once known by heart. A business that poisons the well from which its community drinks has already failed, regardless of what the balance sheet says. Eleanor continued turning pages, stopping suddenly at a dated entry she didn't recognize. In her grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting from his final years was a confession of sorts. There are decisions I've made for profit that now I cannot look my grandchildren in the eye about. The Richardson Creek situation haunts me still. Richardson Creek. She'd never heard of any controversy involving that waterway, though it ran through the company's oldest manufacturing site. The date on the entry was nearly 30 years ago. Eleanor closed the notebook with trembling fingers. History repeating itself. A family legacy of buried secrets in environmental casualties. And now the responsibility sat squarely on her shoulders. She picked up her phone, dialing a number rarely used. Margaret, it's Eleanor Harrington. I need to see you tonight. It's about Richardson Creek and something happening now that's disturbingly similar. 2 hours later, Eleanor sat in a modest home in the historic district, facing Margaret Wilson across a kitchen table. At 70, Margaret remained sharp-minded and direct, her silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob that hadn't changed style since she began as Harrison Harrington's executive assistant 40 years ago. Though officially retired, she remained on the company board, a living connection to its founding principles. Show me what you found, Margaret said without preamble, adjusting her reading glasses. Eleanor spread Michael Grant's documentation across the table, alongside the buried reports she'd uncovered from the company system. She explained the situation in detail, including her encounter with Michael and Sophie. Margaret's expression darkened as she examined the evidence. Your cousin has been busy, I see. What happened with Richardson Creek, Margaret? Why did my grandfather write about it with such regret? Margaret removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Harrison made a terrible mistake. In the early expansion years, the company cut corners on waste management. When contamination was discovered, he chose to cover it up rather than face the financial hit of proper remediation. Children got sick. Some died. The bluntness of her words left Eleanor speechless. By the time he fully understood what had happened, the damage was done. He paid settlements, privately swore everyone to secrecy, and promised himself never again. Margaret's eyes bore into Eleanor's. It changed him. The last decade of his life, he transformed the company's environmental practices, though few understood why he became so insistent on protocols that exceeded regulations. Why didn't he tell me this when he was preparing me to take over? He died before he could, but he left that notebook hoping you'd find his confession when you were ready. Margaret leaned forward. Harrison believed you were different from the rest of the family, that you'd put people before profit when it mattered. Eleanor felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Robert will fight any attempt to address this. The board will back him if it threatens the bottom line. I don't have the authority to unilaterally shut down a production facility. You have more power than you think, Eleanor. You just haven't decided to use it yet. Margaret gathered the papers into a neat stack. The question is whether you're your grandfather's granddaughter or just another Harrington. The drive back to her penthouse apartment gave Eleanor time to think, the city lights blurring as she considered her options. Each path forward seemed to lead to different forms of destruction: her career, the company's stock value, or more children's health. No clean solutions, just choices between different kinds of damage. She pulled into her reserved parking space and sat motionless, remembering Sophie's small face and quiet dignity. The girl's resemblance to herself at that age was unsettling. Before boarding schools and MBA programs had polished away her edges, before she'd learned to value balance sheets over actual balance. Her phone chimed with a message from Robert. Quarterly projections looking strong. Dinner tomorrow to discuss Asian expansion, the usual place. Eleanor left it unanswered, slipping the phone back into her purse as she made her way to the elevator. For the first time since taking the CEO position, she felt uncertain about her path forward. Not about what was right, that had become painfully clear, but about whether she had the courage to do it. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Eleanor's mood as she drove not to Harrington headquarters, but to the small town of Oakwood, 20 miles outside the city limits. She needed to see the situation firsthand, away from boardrooms and balance sheets. She parked her understated sedan several blocks from the shuttered elementary school, pulling a trench coat over her casual clothes and tucking her recognizable blonde hair under a cap. The last thing she needed was to be identified as a Harrington in this community. The school building sat abandoned behind chain-link fencing, a handwritten sign declaring temporarily closed due to environmental concerns. Children's artwork still hung in classroom windows, visible from the street, frozen in time, like artifacts from a suddenly evacuated civilization. Eleanor followed the path that led behind the school to Miller's Creek. The waterway that had once been a natural playground now bore warning signs every few yards. Contaminated water, no swimming or fishing. Even through the rain, she could smell it, a chemical odor that had no place in nature. The water itself had an oily sheen, and no birds or wildlife were visible along its banks. This wasn't just some minor compliance issue, it was devastation. A movement caught her eye. Someone was watching her from the tree line. Eleanor tensed, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, alone in a place where her family name would earn nothing but contempt. The figure stepped forward, and Eleanor's breath caught. Michael Grant, wearing a rain jacket and work boots, his expression shifting from wariness to recognition. Doing a little sightseeing, Ms. Harrington? His voice carried across the space between them, edged with sarcasm. Eleanor stood her ground as he approached. I needed to see it myself. And now that you have... He stopped, a few feet away, rain beating on his shoulders. Up close, without the intimidating backdrop of corporate headquarters, she noticed details she'd missed before. The lines of fatigue around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw that spoke of too many priorities above personal grooming, the watchfulness of someone who'd learned not to expect fairness from life. It's worse than I imagined, she admitted. The reports, they don't capture this. Reports never do. Michael gestured toward the creek. They don't capture the sound of children playing here last summer, or the smell of cookouts on that flat rock over there, or the way this entire community has been holding funerals for kids who should be learning multiplication tables right now. The raw pain in his voice stripped away her professional detachment. This wasn't a liability issue to be managed. It was a community being poisoned by her family's company. I found the buried reports, she said quietly. Robert classified the situation as resolved months ago. Michael's jaw tightened, while children kept getting sick. I'm going to fix this, Mr. Grant. Michael, he corrected automatically, then gave a bitter laugh. And forgive me if I don't immediately trust that declaration. Your family has a history of making promises to people like me. Before she could respond, her phone rang. Robert's ringtone. Eleanor silenced it without looking away from Michael. You should know something, she said carefully. This isn't the first time Harrington Industries has contaminated a community's water. My grandfather did the same thing 30 years ago at Richardson Creek. Michael's expression darkened. And let me guess, he got away with it. He did, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. Eleanor glanced toward the abandoned school. I don't intend to repeat that particular family tradition. Noble words, but what are you actually going to do? It was a fair question, perhaps the only one that mattered. Eleanor took a deep breath, committing herself to a path she knew would bring professional and personal upheaval. First, I'm going to order an immediate shutdown of the production processes causing this contamination. Today, then I'm going to initiate a full environmental assessment by an independent firm, not one in Harrington's pocket. Remediation will begin immediately, regardless of cost. Michael studied her face, searching for insincerity. The board will fight you. Robert will fight you. Almost certainly. Then why are you doing this? What's in it for Eleanor Harrington? The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because she hadn't fully examined her own motivations. Was it guilt, corporate responsibility, or something more personal? Maybe I'm tired of being part of the problem, she finally said. Maybe your daughter's drawing made me remember things I've been trying to forget. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it quickly, his expression shifting to concern. I need to go. Sophie's having breathing trouble again. Eleanor nodded, understanding the abrupt end to their conversation. I meant what I said. Things will change. As Michael turned to leave, she called after him. How is she otherwise? He paused, rain dripping from his jacket. She's a fighter. Gets that from her mother. Something vulnerable crossed his face. Lisa died 2 years ago. Cancer. Maybe unrelated to all this, maybe not. We'll never know. The simple statement hit Eleanor with unexpected force. The realization that behind every statistic in those reports was a story like this one. A life altered or ended, a family broken, futures rewritten. I'm sorry, she said, knowing the inadequacy of the words even as she spoke them. Michael nodded once, then disappeared back through the trees toward town, leaving Eleanor alone by the poisoned creek, the rain falling harder now, plastering her clothes to her skin. She pulled out her phone and dialed her executive assistant. Cancel all my meetings today and call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. The assistant's voice was hesitant. Ms. Harrington, you have the investors call at 8, and Robert specifically asked, 8 a.m. Janet, mandatory attendance, and prepare the shutdown protocols for the Oakwood facility. After ending the call, Eleanor took one last look at the contaminated creek, making a silent promise to the absent children who should have been playing along its banks. Then she turned back toward her car, each step feeling more certain than the last. By the time she reached Harrington headquarters, Eleanor had made 15 calls, issued 4 executive directives, and mentally prepared for the battle ahead. The corporate machine was already pushing back, from legal warnings about shareholder value to production managers insisting the shutdown would break contractual obligations. She walked straight to Robert's office, not bothering to knock before entering. Her cousin looked up from his desk with annoyance that quickly shifted to calculated charm. Ellie, I've been trying to reach you. We need to discuss the Singapore expansion before the board call tomorrow. Eleanor closed the door behind her. I've ordered a complete shutdown of the Oakwood facility effective immediately. The statement hung in the air for 3 seconds before Robert laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Very funny. Now about Singapore. I've seen the creek, Robert. I've seen the shuttered school. I've reviewed the buried reports with your signature on them. She placed both hands on his desk, leaning forward. Did you think I wouldn't find out, that no one would notice children getting sick? Robert's expression hardened, charm evaporating. You've been CEO for what? A year. You don't understand how things work yet. Every manufacturing operation has environmental challenges. We manage them. By hiding reports and ignoring the damage, that's not management, it's criminal negligence. It's business, Robert snapped, standing to match her posture. The Oakwood facility increased production efficiency by 22% under my direction. That's millions in additional revenue. A few compliance issues are expected during any optimization process. Eleanor felt cold fury rising within her. Compliance issues. Children have chronic respiratory conditions. Groundwater is contaminated. An entire school had to close. All temporary situations that will resolve once the body builds immunity or people move away. It happens everywhere there's industry. You're being naive, and you're being a monster. The words escaped before she could moderate them, but she didn't regret them. Robert's face flushed with anger. Watch yourself, Eleanor. Your position isn't as secure as you think. The board appointed you because of your name and your grandfather's wishes, not because anyone believes a 28-year-old with more theoretical knowledge than practical experience should be running this company. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Pull back this shutdown order, and we can forget this conversation happened. Keep pushing, and I'll have no choice but to protect the company from your inexperience. Eleanor straightened, a strange calm settling over her. The shutdown proceeds. The board meeting stands. And Robert, I'm my grandfather's granddaughter in more ways than you realize. She left him seething behind his desk, knowing she'd just declared war against a man who controlled more of the company's operations than she did. A man with board allies and decades of internal connections. Her position had never felt more precarious. Back in her office, Eleanor found a stack of urgent messages and emails waiting, mostly reactions to her shutdown order. She ignored them instead, pulling up Michael Grant's personnel file from the Oakwood facility. The information confirmed what he'd told her. Former Navy mechanical engineer with specialized training in environmental systems. Previous employment at Ecotech Solutions, a respected environmental consulting firm. Even a patent for a small-scale water filtration system. Not just a factory worker, but a skilled professional who'd stepped down the career ladder, presumably after his wife's death. Eleanor checked the family's address, then made a decision that went against every corporate protocol. She grabbed her coat and headed for the garage. The drive to Oakwood took 40 minutes, giving her time to question her own judgment. Showing up unannounced at an employee's home crossed professional boundaries, especially when that employee had filed complaints against the company. The legal department would have collective apoplexy if they knew. Yet something drove her forward, perhaps the need to prove mostly to herself that her commitment went beyond boardroom declarations. Michael's neighborhood revealed the stark contrast between their worlds. Modest homes lined streets in need of repaving, many showing signs of deferred maintenance. A community where most residents live paycheck to paycheck. She found the address, a small blue bungalow with neatly trimmed grass but peeling paint around the windows. As she parked across the street, uncertainty finally caught up with her. What exactly did she hope to accomplish here? Before she could reconsider, the front door opened. Sophie emerged wearing a backpack shaped like a turtle. Michael followed, locking the door behind them. They headed toward an older model sedan parked in the driveway. Eleanor watched them, frozen in indecision. This wasn't a business meeting or a PR opportunity. This was their life. The quiet, ordinary moments that continued regardless of corporate decisions or environmental disasters. Michael spotted her car and stopped abruptly, a recognition crossing his face. He said something to Sophie, who climbed into the backseat of their car. Then he walked deliberately toward Eleanor. She got out to meet him, aware of how out of place her designer coat and leather boots looked on this street. Following me now. Michael's voice was low, presumably to keep Sophie from overhearing. I wanted to tell you in person. I've ordered the Oakwood facility shut down until we can implement proper environmental controls. His expression remained skeptical. Just like that? Just like that, she confirmed. Though just might be the wrong word. Robert is already mobilizing against me. There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning that will likely turn into an attempt to override my decision or remove me altogether. Michael studied her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Why tell me this? Why come here? Eleanor wasn't entirely sure herself. Because you deserve to know. Because I wanted you to believe this isn't just another empty corporate promise. Dad? Sophie called from the car window. We're going to be late for Dr. Martinez. Michael glanced back at his daughter, then returned his attention to Eleanor. I have to take her to her pulmonologist. But this conversation isn't finished. I know. Eleanor hesitated, then added, I read your personnel file. You're an environmental engineer with a patent for water filtration technology. Something hardened in his expression. I was. Now I'm just trying to keep my daughter alive and our heads above water. Why work the night shift at the very factory you believe poisoned your community? You could have found an engineering position elsewhere. You think I didn't try? Michael's voice rose slightly before he caught himself glancing back at Sophie. No engineering firm within commuting distance would touch me after I raised concerns about Harrington. Your family's influence runs deep, and Sophie needs me during the day for medical appointments and homeschooling since her regular school closed. The night shift was the only option that let me be there for her. The reality of his situation struck Eleanor with fresh force. How thoroughly her family's company had constrained this man's choices, trapping him in a cycle of dependence on the very entity harming his child. I want to fix this, she said quietly. Not just the environmental damage, all of it. Michael's laugh held no humor. In my world, Ms. Harrington, a person's worth is measured by what they build with their hands, not what they can buy with their bank account. So far, your family has only built destruction here. With that, he turned and walked back to his car. Eleanor watched as they drove away, Michael's words echoing in her mind. He was right, of course. Intentions meant nothing without actions to back them up. She returned to her car and pulled out her phone, dialing Margaret Wilson's number. I need everything you have on the Richardson Creek incident, she said when Margaret answered. And I need allies on the board for tomorrow's meeting. Robert's coming for me. You've stepped in it now, haven't you? Margaret's voice held a mixture of concern and approval. Come by in an hour. And Eleanor, bring protection. Protection. Information is the only weapon that matters in a boardroom war. Bring everything you have on the Oakwood situation. Eleanor worked through the night in Margaret's study, surrounded by decades of company archives the older woman had preserved, including documents that never made it into official records. Together, they built a case not just for addressing the Oakwood contamination, but for a fundamental restructuring of Harrington's environmental compliance systems. Robert will come prepared, Margaret warned as they organized their materials. He's been positioning himself as your replacement since the day you were appointed. This just gives him the excuse he's been waiting for. Eleanor nodded, fatigue blurring the edges of her vision. I know, but I can't back down now. Your grandfather would be proud, Margaret said softly, surprising Eleanor with the rare personal comment. He made the wrong choice when faced with a similar situation. He always hoped his grandchildren would be braver. I don't feel brave, Eleanor admitted. I feel terrified. But when I saw that little girl today, all I could think was that it could have been me in a different life. That every child deserves better than to be collateral damage in a profit equation. The morning arrived too quickly. Gray light filtering through Margaret's curtains, where Eleanor had eventually fallen asleep on the couch. She awoke disoriented, then remembered. The board meeting. In 2 hours, she'd either secure her vision for the company or lose everything she'd worked for. She showered quickly in Margaret's guest bathroom, then borrowed a pressed blouse to replace her rumpled one. The rest of her appearance would have to do. Ready for battle? Margaret asked, handing her a travel mug of coffee as they loaded documents into Eleanor's car. As ready as I'll ever be. The Harrington Industries boardroom already hummed with tense conversation when Eleanor arrived. She'd deliberately come 15 minutes early, but Robert had beaten her there, standing at the head of the table, her rightful position, talking intently with 3 board members. He looked up as she entered, his smile not reaching his eyes. Eleanor, we were just discussing the concerning decisions made yesterday. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. There is, she replied calmly, setting her materials at her proper place at the head of the table. I'll address everything once the meeting officially begins. Robert reluctantly stepped aside, taking a seat to her right. Other board members filed in the room, filling with power suits and cautious glances. Margaret entered last, giving Eleanor a subtle nod of encouragement. At precisely 8 o'clock, Eleanor called the meeting to order. Before she could outline her agenda, Robert interrupted. Given the emergency nature of this meeting, I move to address the Oakwood shutdown immediately. Our legal department has prepared an analysis of the shareholder impact, which is substantial. Several heads nodded in agreement. Eleanor had expected this attempt to control the narrative. The shutdown is precisely why I called this meeting, she countered smoothly. But we need full context first. I've prepared a comprehensive briefing. She distributed folders to each board member, ignoring Robert's deepening scowl. Yesterday morning, I personally visited Oakwood to verify reports of environmental contamination from our facility there. What I found was not a minor compliance issue, but a significant public health crisis affecting an entire community, one that has been deliberately concealed from this board and from me. She activated the presentation screen, showing photos she'd taken of the contaminated creek and abandoned school. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. These impacts were documented months ago but classified as resolved in our systems. She pulled up the buried reports with Robert's signature. Meanwhile, children continued to get sick, including 37 with documented respiratory conditions directly linked to chemicals unique to our manufacturing process. Every manufacturing operation has environmental challenges, Robert interjected. The costs of addressing every minor issue would cripple our profitability. We manage these situations through proper channels. Is this your definition of proper channels? Eleanor pulled up internal emails showing Robert had ordered his team to reclassify the severity level of the contamination, deliberately downgrading a toxic spill to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements. Murmurs spread around the table. Robert's face flushed. You're taking this out of context, he insisted. Those classification adjustments were based on revised testing protocols, which conveniently you implemented without environmental department approval. Eleanor turned to the board. But this isn't just about Oakwood. There's a pattern here that goes back decades. With Margaret's help, she outlined the Richardson Creek incident from 30 years prior. Her grandfather's covered-up contamination the children affected the settlements paid in secret. Harrington Industries has a legacy of prioritizing profit over people's lives. Eleanor concluded, a legacy I refuse to continue. Robert stood, his composure cracking. This is absurd. You're dragging up ancient history to justify your inexperienced overreaction. That shutdown will cost us millions. The stock is already down 3% this morning on rumors alone. And how much will class action lawsuits cost when the full extent of the contamination becomes public? Eleanor countered. How much will we lose when consumers boycott products made by a company that poisons children? The boardroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Walter Chen, the longest-serving board member besides Margaret, finally spoke. What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor? A comprehensive three-part plan, she answered, handing out another document. First, immediate remediation of the Oakwood contamination regardless of cost. Second, temporary production adjustments to maintain revenue while we implement proper environmental controls. Third, a complete restructuring of our environmental compliance systems with independent oversight. Robert scoffed. This is corporate suicide. The shareholders will revolt. Actually, Eleanor pulled up a final slide. Preliminary market analysis suggests our stock would stabilize within 2 quarters if we take decisive action now, while unchecked litigation could depress it for years. Sometimes the financially responsible choice and the morally right choice align. Board members studied the projections, expressions thoughtful. Robert sensed his advantage slipping. This is all theater, he declared, his voice rising. Eleanor is emotionally compromised. She spent one day with some sob story from a factory worker, and suddenly she's willing to jeopardize everything we've built. This isn't leadership, it's weakness. Is it weakness to prevent children from getting sick? Eleanor challenged. Is it weakness to build a company that creates value without creating victims? It's naive idealism from someone who hasn't earned her position, Robert shot back. You're CEO because of your last name, not because you understand how business actually works. That's enough, Robert. Margaret's voice cut through the tension. Attack the proposal if you wish, but personal attacks are inappropriate in this boardroom. Robert ignored her. I move to vote on reinstating operations at Oakwood immediately and reviewing Eleanor's fitness to continue as CEO. Eleanor felt the room's energy shift. This was the moment. Either she'd maintain control or lose everything. She looked down at her notes at the photos of the contaminated creek at Sophie's drawing, which she'd placed in her folder as a reminder of what was truly at stake. Before we vote, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, there's something else the board should know. She pulled out a final document, one she'd discovered in Margaret's archives at 3 in the morning. This is a soil analysis from the Richardson Creek incident 30 years ago. The chemical signature is identical to what we're seeing in Oakwood today. Not similar, identical. She let that sink in before continuing. The process contaminating Oakwood isn't some new efficiency measure. It's the same corner-cutting approach my grandfather abandoned after children died. the same approach Robert reinstated 18 months ago. Robert lunged for the document. This is preposterous. It's verified, Robert. Eleanor stood her ground. By 3 independent labs. The same toxic process restarted under your directive against established company protocol. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Robert shouting denials, board members demanding explanations, legal counsel requesting a recess. Through it all, Eleanor remained standing, a strange calm washing over her. Whatever happened now, she'd spoken the truth. Walter Chen raised his hand for silence, his authoritative presence eventually quieting the room. I believe we need to vote, he said gravely, not on reinstating Oakwood operations, but on endorsing Eleanor's 3-part plan. Robert protested, but Chen continued. If what we've seen today is accurate, Harrington Industries is facing not just a PR problem, but potential criminal liability. I, for one, want to be on record supporting corrective action. One by one, board members voiced their positions. To Eleanor's surprise, most aligned with her plan, though many expressed concerns about implementation costs. When the final vote was tallied, her proposal passed 8-5. Robert stormed out before she could adjourn the meeting, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The battle was won, but Eleanor harbored no illusions. The war had just begun. Robert wouldn't accept defeat easily, especially with his own misconduct exposed. As board members filtered out offering cautious congratulations or reserved acknowledgments, Margaret remained behind. You did it, the older woman said simply. Phase 1, Eleanor corrected, already thinking ahead to the monumental task before her. Now comes the hard part, actually fixing what's broken. You won't be doing it alone. Eleanor gathered her materials, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline was subsiding. I need to call Michael Grant. He should hear about this from me, not through company channels. Margaret nodded approvingly. You're learning. In leadership, how you deliver news is often as important as the news itself. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself once again in Oakwood, this time sitting across from Michael in a small diner near the town's main street. The vinyl booth squeaked whenever she moved, and the coffee tasted nothing like the artisanal brew she normally drank, but there was something refreshingly unpretentious about the place. Sophie was at a neighbor's house. A rare play date when she's feeling well enough, Michael had explained, allowing them to speak freely. So the board actually backed you. Michael's skepticism remained, though tempered, with cautious hope. Eleanor nodded. Officially, yes. They've approved immediate remediation and a complete overhaul of our environmental compliance systems. Unofficially, many of them are terrified of the liability and just want to mitigate damage. And your cousin, Robert left the meeting early. He's probably plotting his next move as we speak. She wrapped her hands around her mug, appreciating its warmth. This isn't over by any means. Corporate culture doesn't change overnight. Michael studied her face. Why are you really doing this? And don't give me the corporate responsibility speech. What's driving Eleanor Harrington personally? The question deserved an honest answer. Eleanor took a moment to organize her thoughts. When I became CEO, I thought I could change things from within while playing by the established rules. Keep the board happy, hit the quarterly targets, and gradually implement more responsible practices. She sighed. I was wrong. The system is designed to resist meaningful change. That doesn't answer my question. Eleanor met his gaze directly. My grandfather made the same mistake at Richardson Creek that we're making at Oakwood now. He chose profit over people's health. The difference is he lived long enough to regret it, but not long enough to fix it. I have the chance he didn't. Legacy redemption, then. Partly, she admitted, but also because of Sophie. Because when she handed me that drawing, I remembered who I wanted to be before I learned to prioritize shareholder value over actual human lives. She paused, then added quietly, and because someone needs to start seeing the real cost of how we do business, not just the numbers on a spreadsheet. Michael absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful. For the first time since they'd met, he seemed to be seeing her as a person rather than just a Harrington. Sophie asked about you this morning, he said unexpectedly. She wanted to know if the pretty lady was going to help fix the creek. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth at the child's question. What did you tell her? That I didn't know yet, that actions matter more than promises. He leaned forward slightly. So prove me wrong, Eleanor Harrington. Show me your family can do more than destroy. The challenge hung between them. Not angry anymore, but resolute. A challenge she realized she desperately wanted to meet, not just for the company or her grandfather's legacy, but for herself, for the person she still hoped to be. I will, she promised quietly. but I'll need help from someone who actually understands the technical side of environmental remediation. Someone who holds a patent on water filtration systems, for instance. Michael raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job? A consulting position to start. Complete autonomy to design the cleanup approach, reporting directly to me, not through corporate channels. Your design, your team, your timeline. For the first time, she saw genuine surprise break through his carefully maintained guard. Why would you trust me with that? I'm suing your company. Because you care about getting it right more than getting even. Because you understand what's at stake better than anyone in my boardroom. She met his eyes steadily. And because sometimes the hardest person to trust is exactly who you need most. The words hung between them, carrying weight beyond their immediate context. An acknowledgement of the unlikely connection forming between two people from worlds that rarely intersected meaningfully. Michael didn't respond immediately, turning his coffee mug slowly between his palms. I need to think about it, he finally said. This isn't just my decision, it affects Sophie too. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Of course, take whatever time you need. As she drove back to the city that evening, Eleanor found herself in unfamiliar emotional territory. The day's victory felt significant but incomplete. The real work, transforming Harrington Industries, cleaning up Oakwood, changing decades of corporate culture, still lay ahead. And somewhere in the midst of these monumental challenges, she realized she cared what Michael Grant thought of her, not just as a CEO implementing change, but as a person trying to do the right thing against formidable odds. It was this thought that occupied her mind as she pulled into the garage beneath her apartment building, unaware of Robert's car parked in the shadows, or his eyes watching her arrival with calculated hatred. The real battle, as she would soon discover, had only just begun. Eleanor's next 2 weeks blurred together in a storm of activity. Board members requiring reassurance, legal teams drafting remediation plans, PR specialists crafting careful messaging that acknowledged responsibility without admitting liability. Through it all, she caught only fleeting glimpses of Robert, his presence in the building becoming increasingly rare as he conducted business remotely. The eerie absence of her cousin felt more threatening than his open opposition. Eleanor doubled her security protocols, restricting access to sensitive environmental data and installing monitoring systems on the corporate network. Paranoia perhaps, but justified, given what was at stake. Her phone chimed with a message. Michael Grant finally responding to her consulting offer after 7 days of silence. Need to discuss terms in person, tomorrow 7 p.m., Oakwood Community Center. Eleanor's heart quickened slightly. She'd begun to think he'd rejected her proposal outright, choosing instead to pursue legal action against Harrington Industries. This message, terse as it was offered, a thread of hope. She arrived at the community center 15 minutes early the following evening, parking her car a block away. The modest building showed signs of deferred maintenance, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, a playground with equipment dating back decades. Still, someone had planted fresh flowers in window boxes and swept the walkway, small acts of pride amid declining circumstances. The main hall buzzed with activity. Folding tables had been arranged in a semicircle, occupied by 20 or so residents reviewing documents and maps spread across the surfaces. Michael stood at a whiteboard drawing a diagram of what appeared to be groundwater flow patterns. He'd rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, revealing forearms marked with the kind of defined muscle that came from actual work, not gym memberships. Eleanor paused in the doorway, suddenly aware she'd walked into something she wasn't prepared for. This wasn't a private consultation, it was a community meeting. A middle-aged woman noticed her first eyes widening in recognition. That's her, she stage whispered to her neighbor. That's the Harrington woman. Conversations halted like a record scratch in an old movie. All eyes turned toward Eleanor, expressions ranging from surprise to open hostility. Michael lowered his marker, his face unreadable. Ms. Harrington decided to join us tonight, he announced, walking toward her with measured steps. His voice betrayed nothing of their previous conversations or the consulting offer between them. She's here to listen. Eleanor understood immediately. Whatever tentative trust had formed between them, individually, this community had experienced generations of broken promises from her family. If Michael had revealed her offer or appeared aligned with her interests, his credibility with his neighbors would evaporate. She stepped forward, hands clasped to prevent nervous fidgeting. Thank you for allowing me to observe. I'm here to understand the situation from your perspective, not to speak for Harrington Industries. A man in his 60s stood, work boots and calloused hands, marking him as someone who'd spent his life in manual labor. Your family's been understanding our perspective for 3 generations while poisoning our water and our children. What makes today different? The bluntness of his question hung in the air. Eleanor had prepared countless responses for board members and shareholders, but honesty seemed the only viable approach here. Nothing I say tonight will erase decades of harm or broken trust. I'm not here to make promises you have no reason to believe. She took a deep breath. I'm here because decisions about Oakwood's future shouldn't happen in boardrooms without the people most affected having a voice. Her response seemed to surprise them, not with its eloquence, but with its lack of corporate platitudes. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken by a young woman in nursing scrubs. My son developed asthma last year. He's 4. The doctors say he'll probably need inhalers for the rest of his life. What are you going to do about that? One by one, residents shared their stories. Children with chronic respiratory conditions, garden vegetables that withered mysteriously, pets that developed tumors, property values plummeting, dreams of retirement, security evaporating as homes became unsellable. Eleanor listened without interruption, absorbing the human cost of corporate decisions made in air-conditioned boardrooms by people who would never drink the water they contaminated. She took notes, asked clarifying questions when appropriate, and refrained from making defensive comments even when accusations became personal. Michael observed her reactions carefully, saying little himself. Was this a test? Almost certainly. But it wasn't one designed for her to pass or fail. It was an opportunity to demonstrate whether she truly understood what was at stake beyond stock prices and quarterly reports. As the meeting concluded, Michael approached her, keeping his voice low. Walk with me. They exited through a side door into the community center's small garden, illuminated only by security lights. The night air carried the faint chemical smell from the creek, a constant reminder of the problem they faced. That wasn't what I expected when you asked to meet, Eleanor admitted, pulling her coat tighter against the evening chill. Michael's expression remained guarded. Those people needed to see a Harrington face the consequences of your company's actions directly, not through lawyers or press releases. Sophie's not the only child suffering. I know. Eleanor glanced back at the building where community members were still gathering their materials. This isn't about public relations or limiting liability for me, not anymore. What is it about then? The question echoed their diner conversation, but now carried more weight after hearing so many stories of suffering. Redemption, maybe. Not just for my family name, but for the kind of business practices we've normalized. She paused, searching for words. When my grandfather gave me his notebook, he told me that someday I'd face a moment where I'd have to choose what kind of leader I wanted to be. I think this is that moment. Michael studied her face in the dim light. And what kind of leader is that? One who measures success by more than just profit margins. She met his gaze directly. One who understands that sometimes the right path is also the hardest one. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps the first real consideration that her intentions might be genuine. I'll take the consulting position, he finally said, but with conditions: full transparency with the community, independent testing they select, and a health fund for affected families that doesn't require liability waivers. Done, Eleanor agreed without hesitation. I'll have legal draft the agreement tomorrow. Michael shook his head. No, not your legal team. We'll use independent counsel that represents both interests. Your company's lawyers serve shareholders, not Oakwood residents. The request was reasonable, yet would be viewed as heresy by Harrington's general counsel. Eleanor nodded anyway. Agreed, I'll make it happen. A child's voice called from across the garden. Dad, I finished my homework. Sophie bounded toward them, a colorful knitted hat pulled over her ears against the evening chill. She stopped abruptly upon recognizing Eleanor, suddenly shocked. You're the lady from the big building, she said, moving closer to her father's side. Eleanor knelt to the child's eye level, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I am. My name is Eleanor. It's nice to see you again, Sophie. Sophie studied her with the unfiltered curiosity unique to children. Are you going to fix our creek so we can go back to school? The directness of the question, devoid of adult cynicism, caught Eleanor off guard. I'm going to try my very best. Your dad is going to help me. Sophie's face brightened. Really, Dad can fix anything. He made my bike work when the chain kept falling off, and he built me a treehouse in the backyard. Michael placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. It's a bit more complicated than bike chains, kiddo. But yes, I'm going to help Ms. Harrington's company clean up the creek. Sophie looked between the adults, processing this information with surprising perceptiveness. Does that mean you're not mad at each other anymore? The innocent question hung in the air. Eleanor glanced at Michael, unsure how to navigate this unexpected terrain. Sometimes grown-ups can work together even when they don't agree on everything, Michael explained gently. Like how you and Jamie still play together even after you argued about whose turn it was on the swing. Sophie considered this wisdom, then nodded seriously. Okay, but you should be friends. Dad doesn't have many friends since Mom went to heaven. Michael's expression tightened, the personal revelation clearly making him uncomfortable. Soph, remember our conversation about private family matters. Sorry, Dad. Sophie looked genuinely contrite, then turned to Eleanor with solemn eyes. Forget I said that part. Eleanor pretended to zip her lips, earning a small smile from the child. Already forgotten. It was nice seeing you again, Sophie. As she walked back to her car, Eleanor couldn't shake Sophie's innocent observation. The comment revealed a vulnerability in Michael she hadn't considered. Not just a grieving widower or an angry environmental advocate, but a man isolated by loss and circumstance, raising a daughter alone in a community under siege. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, Robert's name flashing on the screen. Eleanor hesitated, then declined it, sending a text instead. In a meeting, we'll call back in an hour. Robert's response came immediately. Don't bother. Board members raising concerns about Oakwood costs. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eleanor sighed, slipping the phone back into her pocket. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly every day. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in her office reviewing the independent counsel's draft agreement for Michael's consulting role. The terms were fair, but would raise eyebrows among the board, particularly the health fund and community oversight provisions. She signed it without changes, then forwarded it to Margaret Wilson for review before sending it to Michael. Her office door opened without a knock, something only one person in the building would dare. Robert strode in, immaculately dressed as always, though subtle signs of strain showed in the tightness around his eyes. Quite the corporate transformation you've initiated, he remarked, dropping into a chair across from her desk without invitation. Environmental overhauls, community outreach, independent consultants. The shareholders are getting nervous. Eleanor maintained her composure despite the intrusion. The shareholders should be more concerned about the class action lawsuit we narrowly avoided by taking proactive measures. The remediation costs are a bargain compared to potential damages. Always the pragmatist. Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. But we both know this isn't about fiscal responsibility. This is about your misguided crusade to redefine Harrington Industries according to your grandfather's sentimental vision. My grandfather built this company from nothing. His vision worked pretty well for 50 years. His vision belonged to a different era. Today's global marketplace requires agility and competitive edge, not moral philosophizing. Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping. The board indulged your Oakwood shutdown because they feared legal exposure, but they're growing impatient with the expanding scope and costs. The board approved my 3-part plan, Eleanor reminded him, including restructuring our environmental compliance systems company-wide. Approvals can be rescinded, especially when quarterly projections start showing the financial impact of your initiatives. Robert stood adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. Just some friendly advice, cousin. Don't mistake a tactical retreat for surrender. This company has been shaped by Harringtons with vision for 3 generations. We don't all share your particular interpretation of that legacy. After he left, Eleanor sat motionless, absorbing the thinly veiled threat. Robert was mobilizing board members, likely emphasizing the financial costs without contextualizing the benefits of avoiding litigation and rebuilding community trust. She pulled out her grandfather's notebook, turning to an entry she'd reread many times over the past weeks. The true cost of business isn't measured on quarterly statements, but in the world we leave behind. Profit without principle isn't success, it's just sophisticated theft. Words that had once seemed idealistic now felt like a roadmap. She picked up the phone and dialed Margaret Wilson. Robert's making his move with the board, she said when Margaret answered. We need to accelerate our timeline. 3 days later, Michael Grant stood beside Eleanor at the edge of Miller's Creek, watching as environmental engineers took soil and water samples. The morning sun cast long shadows across the contaminated waterway, the team in hazmat suits creating an apocalyptic tableau against the otherwise peaceful landscape. Initial results should be available by tomorrow, Michael explained, consulting his tablet. But visual inspection already confirms what we suspected. Contamination extends further upstream than your previous reports indicated. Eleanor nodded, making notes. We'll expand the testing area, whatever it takes to get an accurate assessment. That will increase costs significantly. So be it. Michael studied her with quiet assessment. Since accepting the consulting position 4 days ago, he'd expected resistance from corporate headquarters at each escalating expense. Instead, Eleanor had approved every recommendation without hesitation, often expanding the scope beyond his initial proposals. The community meeting is set for Friday evening, he said. They'll expect concrete timelines and commitments, not just promises of further study. I'll have preliminary budgets approved by then, and the health fund established. Eleanor checked her watch. I need to head back for a board call. Will you be at the office tomorrow to review the test results? Michael nodded, still adapting to his new routine of dividing time between fieldwork in Oakwood and meetings at Harrington headquarters. The corporate environment remained foreign territory. Security badges, executive elevators, administrative assistants tracking his movements. He'd kept his night shift position at the factory, unwilling to become financially dependent on a consulting role that could evaporate if corporate priorities shifted. Sophie asked if you're coming to her science fair presentation on Saturday, he said, unexpectedly surprising himself with the personal invitation. Eleanor looked equally caught off guard. I hadn't planned on it. Would that be appropriate? She's doing her project on water filtration. Apparently you've become something of a fascination for her. The lady CEO trying to clean up the creek. Michael shifted uncomfortably. You don't have to come. I just promised I'd ask. I'd like to, Eleanor replied carefully, if you're comfortable with it. The conversation hovered on the edge of something neither seemed prepared to acknowledge, the gradual evolution of their professional necessity into something less defined. Not friendship exactly, but a connection forged through shared purpose and the strange intimacy of crisis. Before Michael could respond, Eleanor's phone chimed with a message. Her expression darkened as she read it. I have to go. There's a situation at headquarters. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for the invitation. Let Sophie know I'll be there. As Eleanor drove back to the city, her mind raced through possible scenarios. The cryptic message from Margaret. Board meeting called without you. Are presenting alternative remediation plan. Suggested Robert had moved faster than anticipated. She arrived at Harrington Tower to find security guards she didn't recognize stationed outside the main boardroom. One stepped forward as she approached. I'm sorry, Ms. Harrington, the meeting is closed session. Eleanor drew herself to her full height, summoning every ounce of authority her position afforded. I'm the CEO of this company. There are no closed sessions I'm not permitted to attend. The guard shifted uncomfortably. We have specific instructions, ma'am. Board members and approved presenters only. Before Eleanor could respond, the boardroom doors opened. Margaret Wilson emerged, her expression grim but determined. Eleanor, good, walk with me. She led the way to her private office without waiting for a response. Once inside with the door closed, Margaret didn't mince words. Robert's making his play. He's brought in Axiom Environmental, a remediation specialist with suspiciously close ties to several board members' other business interests. They're proposing a plan that would cost half what you've budgeted and take a third of the time. That's not possible without cutting corners, Eleanor protested. We haven't even completed full testing yet. Of course it's not possible, but it sounds appealing to board members worried about next quarter's numbers. Margaret handed Eleanor a folder. Here's what they're presenting. My assistant obtained it this morning. Eleanor scanned the document, her alarm growing with each page. The plan proposed minimal soil removal chemical treatments with questionable long-term effects and a monitoring program designed to produce favorable results through selective sampling. This isn't remediation. It's a cover-up with a scientific veneer, she said, closing the folder in disgust. Margaret nodded grimly. Robert's argument is that your plan is excessive, emotional, and unnecessarily costly. He's positioned this as the responsible middle ground between doing nothing and your comprehensive approach. How's it being received? Mixed. Some board members are skeptical, but others see an easy way out of a costly situation. Margaret's expression softened slightly. You've made real enemies with this crusade, Eleanor. Powerful ones with financial interests beyond Harrington Industries. What are my options? Limited at this point. The meeting's been structured to exclude you deliberately. By the time you force your way in or challenge the procedural validity, they may have already voted on a resolution. Margaret checked her watch. But there's another approach. Eleanor listened intently as Margaret outlined a counterplay. Not a frontal assault, but a flanking maneuver that would require perfect timing and an unlikely ally. It could work, Eleanor conceded, but it depends on Michael being willing to risk his position. Robert would never forgive him. From what you've told me about Mr. Grant, he didn't take this consulting role for job security or corporate advancement. Margaret's eyes held a steely determination that reminded Eleanor why her grandfather had trusted this woman implicitly. Sometimes the hardest person to trust is exactly who you need most. The words, her own spoken to Michael in the diner, came back with unexpected resonance. Eleanor nodded, pulling out her phone to make the call that would either secure Oakwood's future or destroy her last chance to make things right. The next day's emergency board session began precisely at 2 p.m. Eleanor had spent the morning in careful preparation, with Margaret and Michael leaving nothing to chance. Robert arrived flanked by representatives from Axiom Environmental, his confidence evident in his relaxed stride and easy smile for fellow board members. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly when Michael entered behind Eleanor, a factory worker and community representative walking into the inner sanctum of corporate power. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, unused to outside observers in these proceedings. Robert recovered quickly. Eleanor, while we appreciate your dedication to the Oakwood situation, this meeting was called specifically to review alternative approaches with independent experts. Mr. Grant's presence seems inappropriate given his personal involvement. Mr. Grant is our contracted environmental remediation consultant with specific expertise in water filtration systems, Eleanor replied smoothly. His presence is not only appropriate, but essential for informed discussion of any proposed alternatives. Before Robert could object further, Walter Chen intervened. I see no issue with having technical expertise available during our deliberations. Let's proceed. Robert's presentation was masterfully crafted. Charts showing cost savings timelines, promising swift resolution, and testimonials from other communities where Axiom had implemented similar solutions. To board members with limited environmental knowledge, it appeared comprehensive and reasonable. Eleanor allowed the presentation to conclude without interruption, watching board members' reactions carefully. When Robert finally opened the floor for questions, she nodded slightly to Michael. He stepped forward, tablet in hand. I have several technical concerns about the proposed methodology, particularly regarding the long-term efficacy of chemical stabilization in clay-heavy soil conditions. The Axiom representative, a polished man in an expensive suit, smiled condescendingly. I assure you our approach has been validated through multiple implementations in similar conditions. Similar to Oakwood specifically. Michael tapped his tablet, sending documents to the boardroom's presentation screen. Because our soil composition analysis shows unusual concentrations of manufacturing byproducts that would react problematically with the chemicals you're proposing. The screen filled with technical data most board members couldn't fully comprehend, but the Axiom representative's momentary hesitation spoke volumes. We would adjust formulations as needed. He recovered, though less confidently. Based on what testing, Michael pressed? Your proposal doesn't include site-specific soil chemistry evaluation before treatment. Without that, you're essentially experimenting with unknown reactions in a watershed that feeds into residential water supplies. For the next 30 minutes, Michael systematically dismantled the Axiom proposal with the precision of someone who understood both the science and the real-world implications. He wasn't performing for the board. He was advocating for his community with the expertise of a trained environmental engineer and the personal investment of a father whose child's health hung in the balance. Eleanor watched board members' expressions shift from confusion to concern as they realized the corners being cut in the proposal they'd been considering. When Michael finished his technical assessment, she seized the moment. There's another factor the board should consider. She distributed folders containing information not included in the official meeting materials. These are public health statistics for Oakwood and surrounding communities over the past decade. The documents showed climbing rates of respiratory conditions, unusual cancer clusters, and other health issues corresponding with the timeline of increased production at the Harrington facility. The legal department has prepared an assessment of potential liability if we implement a partial solution that fails to address these ongoing health impacts. Eleanor let the implications sink in. The immediate savings Robert's proposal offers would be dwarfed by the long-term cost, both financial and human. Robert's face had hardened into a mask of controlled fury. This is emotional manipulation dressed up as fiscal responsibility. Eleanor has lost objectivity due to her personal connection with Mr. Grant and the Oakwood community. Sometimes the truest leadership comes from those with the courage to see the people behind the spreadsheets. Eleanor countered, her voice steady despite the direct attack. We're not just cleaning up a creek. We're determining what kind of company Harrington Industries will be for generations to come. The boardroom fell silent as members processed the competing visions before them. Walter Chen finally broke the silence. I move that we reaffirm our commitment to Ms. Harrington's original remediation plan with the technical modifications Mr. Grant has outlined today. The vote that followed wasn't unanimous, but the majority sided with Eleanor's approach. As board members filed out, Robert lingered, waiting until only Eleanor, Michael, and Margaret remained. Impressive performance, he said, his voice deceptively casual. Bringing in your pet engineer to scare the board with technical jargon and worst-case scenarios. Creative. It wasn't a performance, Robert. It was the truth. Something this board hasn't heard enough of regarding Oakwood. Eleanor gathered her materials, refusing to be baited into a more emotional response. Robert turned his attention to Michael. You've chosen your side carefully, Mr. Grant. I hope it serves you well when this crusade inevitably collapses under its own idealistic weight. Michael met Robert's gaze without flinching. I chose the side that doesn't see my daughter's health as an acceptable sacrifice for profit margins. How charmingly simplistic. Robert straightened his tie with manicured fingers. The world runs on practical compromises, not moral absolutes. You'll learn that lesson eventually, though perhaps not while under my cousin's protection. After he left, Michael exhaled slowly, the confidence he'd displayed during his presentation giving way to the tension of confronting power so directly. He won't stop, Margaret warned. Today was a setback, not a defeat. He'll find another approach. Eleanor nodded, already anticipating Robert's next move. We need to work faster. Get the remediation started before he can regroup. I'll have the equipment mobilized by Monday, Michael confirmed. But Eleanor, there's something else we should discuss. The contamination patterns in the newest tests suggest the problem started before the production expansion 18 months ago, possibly years earlier. The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just Robert's doing. The company's environmental negligence predated his leadership of the production division, raising questions about who else might have known and remained silent. Send me everything, Eleanor said quietly, no matter where it leads. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in the bleachers of Oakwood Elementary's gymnasium, watching Sophie Grant present her science fair project on water filtration systems. The school had reopened partially for weekend activities, while environmental testing of the main building continued, creating an atmosphere of cautious normalcy. Sophie had constructed a working model demonstrating how different natural materials could filter contaminants from water. Her presentation was remarkably sophisticated for a 7-year-old, complete with test results and hand-drawn charts. Eleanor couldn't help but notice Michael's influence in the methodical approach alongside a creative energy that was entirely Sophie's own. Parents and teachers applauded as Sophie concluded her presentation. Michael caught Eleanor's eye from across the gymnasium, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. They'd agreed to maintain a professional distance during community events, avoiding any appearance that the remediation efforts were being influenced by personal connections. As families mingled around the science projects, Eleanor felt distinctly out of place. Her designer clothes and Manhattan polish marked her as an outsider among people who shopped at discount stores and worked with their hands. Yet no one treated her with the open hostility she'd encountered at the community center meeting. Progress, however, small. A woman approached, hesitating before speaking. You're Eleanor Harrington, right? I'm Jamie's mom, Sophie's friend from school. Eleanor nodded, preparing for the usual recitation of grievances against her company. I just wanted to say thank you. The woman's voice wavered slightly. For the health fund, Jamie's asthma treatments weren't covered by our insurance. The assistance program your company set up is, well, it's making a real difference for us. Before Eleanor could respond, Jamie's mother continued, I know one good deed doesn't erase everything that happened, but it matters to us that someone is finally trying to make things right. As the woman walked away, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. The health fund, established with her personal investment before corporate resources could be allocated, was helping real families with immediate needs while the longer-term remediation plan unfolded. Small victories amid an ongoing battle. She glimpsed Sophie running toward her father, science fair ribbon clutched proudly in her small hand. Michael lifted her in a celebratory hug, his usual guardedness melting away in his daughter's triumph. The simple joy of that moment, a father's pride, a child's accomplishment, crystallized everything Eleanor was fighting for. Her phone vibrated with an incoming message. Not Robert this time, but the head of Harrington's legal department. Urgent situation developing, internal documents leaked to press re-Oakwood contamination. Call immediately. Eleanor stared at the message, its implications unfolding in her mind like a chess game suddenly accelerated. Someone had decided to change the rules of engagement, forcing her hand before the remediation could begin. Across the gymnasium, Michael's expression shifted as he checked his own phone. Their eyes met across the crowded space, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The next phase of their battle had begun with higher stakes and less room for error than either had anticipated. As parents and children celebrated around them, Eleanor and Michael remained momentarily frozen in their private understanding. Two people from different worlds united by circumstances neither would have chosen, facing a storm that threatened everything they'd worked to build. The media storm hit with the force of a hurricane. By morning, Harrington Industries dominated headlines across major news outlets. Corporate cover-up leaked documents showed decades of toxic dumping. The documents, released anonymously to 5 prominent environmental journalists, traced a pattern of deliberate contamination dating back 20 years, far longer than even Eleanor had suspected. Eleanor stood in her office, television muted, as cable news showed aerial footage of Miller's Creek chemical sheen visible even from that height. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since 5 a.m. Board members demanding explanations, PR team requesting direction, reporters seeking comments. Through it all, one question burned in her mind: who leaked the documents? The timing was too perfect, the selection too precise. Someone with intimate knowledge of Harrington Industries' internal systems had orchestrated this, choosing exactly which records would cause maximum damage while implicating specific executives. The question was whether they'd done it to help her cause or destroy it. Michael arrived without an appointment, security having been instructed to grant him unrestricted access. His expression was grim, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as little as she had. "You've seen the news." It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, gesturing toward her desk where printouts of the leaked documents lay spread across the surface. Michael picked up a particularly damning internal memo from 2010. This proves that contamination began long before Robert took over production. Your uncle authorized the disposal protocol changes with full knowledge of the environmental impacts, and conveniently retired 2 years ago with a golden parachute, leaving others to deal with the consequences. Eleanor ran a hand through her hair, a rare display of frayed composure. The board is in panic mode. Half want to issue blanket denials, the other half want to throw lower-level employees under the bus. What do you want to do? The question hung between them, simple words carrying the weight of a legacy-defining decision. Eleanor turned to the window. The city skyline spread before her like a vast chessboard where invisible power moves determine thousands of lives. The truth, all of it, not just about what happened, but why and who knew. She turned back to face him, resolve hardening her features. No matter who it implicates, including my family. Michael's eyes widened slightly, the full implication sinking in. That could destroy Harrington Industries as it exists today. Maybe it should be destroyed, or at least transformed into something better. Eleanor moved to her desk, picking up another document. These weren't just mistakes or oversights. They were calculated decisions to prioritize profit over people's lives. The company my grandfather built wouldn't recognize what it's become. The intercom buzzed, her assistant's voice unnaturally tight. "Miss Harrington, the executive committee is gathering in the main boardroom. Mr. Harrington is requesting your immediate presence." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with Michael. "Robert's making his move." "You're walking into an ambush." "Probably." She gathered her tablet and several folders. "Come with me." Michael hesitated, awareness of class boundaries momentarily reasserting itself. "That's not my place. I'm just a consultant." "No, you're the one person in this building besides Margaret who cares more about doing what's right than protecting corporate interests." Eleanor headed for the door. "Besides, you're the technical expert they'll need to question when they try to claim remediation is impossible now." The boardroom crackled with hostile energy when they arrived. Robert stood at the head of the table, Eleanor's rightful position, flanked by the company's general counsel and chief financial officer. 8 other executives lined both sides, faces grim. The only friendly presence was Margaret Wilson, seated near the far end, her expression revealing nothing. Robert's eyes narrowed at Michael's presence, but he didn't waste time on objections. "The situation has escalated beyond your control, Eleanor. The executive committee has convened an emergency session to address the crisis before further damage occurs." Eleanor took her rightful place at the table's head, forcing Robert to step aside, or create an even more awkward confrontation. Since I'm still CEO of this company, perhaps you'd like to explain why this session was convened without my knowledge. Time-sensitive crisis management. The general counsel slid a document toward her. Given your personal involvement with the Oakwood situation, there were concerns about potential conflicts of interest. Eleanor left the document untouched. My personal involvement consists of addressing environmental crimes committed by this company before I became CEO. Crimes documented in our own internal records, which someone has now made public. That's what we need to discuss, Robert interjected. The leak was clearly orchestrated by someone with inside access. Given your relationship with Mr. Grant and the Oakwood community, questions have naturally arisen about your possible involvement. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. "Let's be absolutely clear," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "I discovered the extent of this contamination the same way everyone in this room did, through leaked documents I'd never seen before today. Documents that implicate executives who made these decisions long before I became CEO." The CFO leaned forward, a hawk-like man whose entire career had been dedicated to maximizing shareholder returns. "The question isn't who created the problem, but who's responsible for containing it now. The stock has dropped 18% since markets opened. We're facing potential criminal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and catastrophic reputational damage. All because the company poisoned a community for 20 years and got caught," Michael interjected, drawing outraged looks from several executives. Robert's smile was sharp as a blade. "Mr. Grant's presence underscores my concerns. Eleanor has allowed an adversarial outside consultant with clear personal interests to access sensitive corporate information during a crisis. Mr. Grant is here because he understands the technical aspects of the contamination better than anyone in this room," Eleanor countered, "including how to fix it, which should be our priority." "Our priority is survival," the general counsel insisted. "We need to contain this legally and from a PR perspective before addressing remediation options." Eleanor surveyed the faces around the table. Men and women who'd built careers on corporate pragmatism, for whom ethics were flexible concepts to be shaped around quarterly targets. They weren't evil people individually, but collectively they had created a system where moral considerations became externalities to be managed rather than principles to be upheld. "Let me be clear about my position," she said finally. "I intend to issue a public statement today acknowledging the accuracy of the leaked documents, committing to full remediation of Oakwood and any other affected sites, and pledging cooperation with any regulatory or criminal investigations." The room erupted in protests. The PR director looked physically ill. The general counsel began listing potential liability implications in rapid-fire succession. Robert raised a hand for silence, his expression calculating. That approach would destroy this company, costing thousands of jobs and billions in shareholder value. The board won't allow it. "The board doesn't have a choice if they want to salvage anything from this situation," Eleanor replied. "We've been caught red-handed. Denial will only compound the damage and extend the crisis." "There are other options," Robert countered. "We issue a statement acknowledging concerns raised by the documents while questioning their completeness and context. We announce an internal investigation led by outside counsel. We express commitment to community health while admitting no specific liability. We buy time." Several executives nodded in agreement. It was the standard corporate crisis playbook: delay, deflect, deny, without explicitly denying. "That approach might have worked 20 years ago," Michael said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement. "But we're in a different world now. People have lost faith in corporate promises and legal maneuvering. They want accountability." "With all due respect, Mr. Grant, you're not a public relations expert," the PR director responded, voice dripping with condescension. "No, I'm a father watching his daughter struggle to breathe because your company valued profit over her health." Michael's bluntness silenced the room. "I'm also the person who spent 6 months documenting exactly how your containment systems were deliberately designed to fail during high production periods. Information I'd be happy to share with federal prosecutors if you attempt to mislead the public again." The threat landed like a grenade. Several executives exchanged alarmed glances, suddenly reassessing the factory worker they'd dismissed as irrelevant. Eleanor seized the opening. "We have two paths forward: my approach of full transparency and commitment to remediation, which will be painful but potentially salvageable, or Robert's approach of minimal admission and maximum denial, which might buy time but will ultimately destroy all remaining trust when the full truth inevitably emerges. Margaret Wilson spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of institutional memory. Harrison Harrington faced a similar moment with Richardson Creek 30 years ago. He chose concealment over accountability, and that decision haunted him until his death. The question today isn't what costs less or what shareholders prefer. It's what kind of company we want to be moving forward. Robert's expression hardened. Touching sentiment, Margaret, but sentiments don't keep companies solvent or people employed. Neither does criminal liability for environmental crimes, Eleanor countered. She turned to the general counsel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but given the evidence in those leaked documents, aren't we already facing potential criminal charges, regardless of what statement we issue today? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. There are certain exposure risks that can't be mitigated through communication strategy alone. Then our best option is to get ahead of this. Show we're taking responsibility and implementing real change, not just damage control. Eleanor looked around the table. I'm still CEO of this company. Unless the board votes to remove me today, we will proceed with full disclosure and a comprehensive remediation commitment. The executive committee meeting adjourned without formal resolution, each member retreating to assess their personal exposure and options. Eleanor returned to her office with Michael and Margaret, the three forming an unlikely alliance against the corporate machine mobilizing against them. Robert won't accept defeat, Margaret warned as they strategized. He'll call an emergency board meeting, probably tonight or tomorrow morning. He'll frame your approach as emotionally driven and financially catastrophic. Let him try, Eleanor said, reviewing the draft statement her communications team was preparing. The documents are already public. Denying them would make us look worse. Michael paced by the window, uncomfortable in the executive setting, but unwilling to leave Eleanor without support. What about the health impacts? There are children in Oakwood who will need medical care for years, possibly their entire lives. Will your statement address that? Eleanor nodded. Full medical support for affected residents. No liability waivers required. It's the right thing to do regardless of cost. The board will fight that specifically, Margaret cautioned. Open-ended medical commitment without liability protection goes against everything corporate legal strategy is designed to prevent. Then I'll fund it personally if necessary. My family has made enough money from this company to cover it. Eleanor's determination was absolute, surprising even herself with the depth of her commitment. The conversation paused as Eleanor's assistant entered with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression darkening. Roberts called an emergency board meeting for 6 o'clock tonight. The agenda includes a vote on temporary leadership transition during the current crisis. She looked up at her allies. He's moving to suspend me. The next 3 hours passed in frantic preparation. Eleanor gathered allies, documented her crisis response plan, and prepared arguments against her suspension. Michael worked with the environmental team to create a feasible remediation timeline that could be included in the public statement. Margaret activated her network of long-time board relationships, quietly reminding members of past crises where hasty leadership changes had backfired. At 5:30, as Eleanor reviewed her final notes before the board meeting, her office door opened without a knock. Robert entered alone and unnervingly calm. I thought we might speak privately before the theatrics begin. He closed the door behind him, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. One last chance to find a mutually beneficial approach. Eleanor remained seated behind her desk, maintaining the power position. There's nothing mutual about your attempt to suspend me for doing the right thing. The right thing? Robert laughed softly. Such a subjective concept. What's right for the Oakwood residents might be devastating for our employees worldwide if the company collapses under liability claims. Those aren't mutually exclusive concerns. We can address the damage we've caused while restructuring to ensure the company survives. Robert approached her desk, resting his fingertips lightly on its polished surface. I'm offering you a dignified exit. Temporary medical leave citing the stress of the crisis. You keep your benefits, your reputation remains intact, and in 6 months you transition to a comfortable board position with another corporation. Everyone saves face. While you take control and bury the truth as deeply as possible. Eleanor shook her head. Not interested. Don't be naive. Robert's voice hardened. I've spent the afternoon speaking with major shareholders. They're concerned about your judgment, your relationships with adversarial parties, your emotional investment in this issue. The vote tonight is a formality. We'll see. Robert studied her genuine curiosity breaking through his calculated facade. I never understood what my uncle saw in you. So much potential, yet you wasted on idealistic crusades instead of building real power. Maybe he recognized that power without purpose becomes its own kind of prison. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. You've spent your entire career climbing toward a position that's hollowed you out completely. I'm choosing a different path. Something flickered across Robert's features. Not quite hurt, but perhaps recognition. We could have been formidable allies, you and I. Instead, you've chosen that factory worker and his emotional appeals over your own family. Michael Grant has more integrity in his calloused hands than exists in this entire executive floor. Eleanor stood signaling the end of their conversation. And he understands something you never will. That true legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in lives improved. The boardroom was filled to capacity when Eleanor arrived. All 13 board members present, unusual for an emergency meeting. Legal counsel lined one wall, financial advisors another. Michael and Margaret sat near the back, their presence drawing disapproving glances from several board members. Walter Chen, the lead independent director, called the meeting to order with visible discomfort. We face an unprecedented situation requiring immediate action. Mr. Harrington has requested we consider temporary leadership adjustments during this crisis period. Robert stood projecting confidence and gravitas. Board members, the documents leaked to the press have created an existential threat to Harrington Industries. While concerning, they represent selective information without full context. Unfortunately, Ms. Harrington has already indicated her intention to issue a statement essentially admitting liability for actions that occurred before her tenure. He paused for effect, scanning the room. This approach, while perhaps emotionally satisfying, exposes the company to catastrophic legal and financial consequences that could threaten our very existence. It reflects a concerning pattern of decision-making driven by personal considerations rather than fiduciary responsibility. Eleanor watched the board members' reactions, noting who nodded in agreement and who remained neutral. The division seemed roughly even, with several key members clearly undecided. When Robert finished his presentation, complete with projected financial impacts and legal exposure assessments, Walter Chen turned to Eleanor. Ms. Harrington, would you care to respond? Eleanor rose slowly, taking a moment to make eye contact with each board member. 24 hours ago, most of us were unaware of the full extent of contamination at Oakwood. Now we know it wasn't an isolated incident or recent development, but a systematic pattern spanning 2 decades. We cannot undo that knowledge, nor can we pretend the documents don't exist. She activated her presentation, showing the draft statement her team had prepared. I'm proposing we acknowledge the truth, commit to full remediation, establish a health fund for affected residents, and cooperate with all investigations. Yes, this approach carries significant cost and potential liability, but the alternative, denial and obfuscation, carries even greater long-term risk in today's environment. The general counsel interrupted. The statement as drafted amounts to an admission of criminal liability. It would effectively eliminate any defensive position in subsequent litigation. What defensive position? Eleanor challenged. The documents are authentic. The contamination is documented. Children are sick. These are facts, not allegations we can credibly dispute. Robert seized on the exchange. This emotional approach to a legal and financial crisis perfectly illustrates my concerns. Eleanor's personal involvement with the Oakwood situation, including her inappropriate relationship with Mr. Grant, has compromised her judgment. The insinuation hung in the air, deliberately ambiguous, yet damaging. Michael stiffened in his seat but remained silent, aware that any reaction would only reinforce Robert's narrative. Eleanor refused to dignify the accusation with a direct response. My relationship with Mr. Grant is precisely what this company needs. A connection to the real people affected by our actions. Corporate leadership isolated from consequences is what created this crisis in the first place. For the next hour, board members debated the competing approaches: financial impacts versus moral obligations, short-term stock protection versus long-term reputation, legal strategy versus ethical responsibility. The discussion revealed fundamental divisions in how different members viewed the company's purpose and responsibilities. As the debate continued, Eleanor noticed Robert checking his phone with increasing frequency, a subtle smile forming at the corners of his mouth. Something was happening outside the boardroom that gave him confidence. Her own phone vibrated with an urgent message from her communications director. Breaking news. Anonymous source claims Harrington Industries executives discussing bankruptcy protection to avoid Oakwood liability. Stock in freefall. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she scanned the news alert. Someone, almost certainly Robert, had leaked selective information about their crisis discussions to manipulate market reaction and force the board's hand. The manufactured panic would pressure uncertain members to choose the seemingly safer option of leadership change and damage control. She caught Michael's eye, subtly signaling him to check his phone. His expression darkened as he read the news, immediately understanding the tactical move in play. Walter Chen cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the meeting. Given the accelerating situation, I believe we should proceed to a vote on the temporary leadership question. Unless there are further substantive points to consider, the moment hung suspended, balanced between competing visions for the company's future. Eleanor recognized that conventional arguments about financial impacts or legal strategy would fail against Robert's manufactured market panic. She needed something more fundamental. Before we vote, I'd like Mr. Grant to address the board directly. Her request drew surprised looks and immediate objection from Robert. This is highly irregular. Mr. Grant is not a board member or company executive. No, Eleanor agreed. He's something more important in this moment. The voice of the people we've harmed. Walter Chen studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll allow it briefly. Michael stood clearly uncomfortable addressing the board, but determined nonetheless. I'm not going to talk about stock prices or legal strategy. I want to tell you about my daughter, Sophie. He pulled out his phone, showing a photo of Sophie with her science fair project. She's 7 years old. Before your factory contaminated our water, she was a normal, healthy kid who loved swimming and playing soccer. Now she needs breathing treatments twice a day. Her lungs are damaged, possibly permanently. Michael scrolled to another photo, Sophie in a hospital bed connected to an oxygen machine. This was 3 months ago during her worst respiratory attack. The doctors weren't sure if she would recover. The boardroom fell silent, the abstract concept of affected residents suddenly given a specific face and story. Sophie isn't unique. There are 36 other children in Oakwood with similar conditions. 5 elderly residents have died from cancers potentially linked to the contamination. This isn't about quarterly earnings or stock prices. It's about real people whose lives have been irreversibly changed by decisions made in rooms like this. Michael put his phone away, his expression resolute. You're facing a choice between protecting the company's money or protecting its soul. Only one of those is truly irreplaceable. As he returned to his seat, Eleanor could sense the shift in the room's energy. Several board members looked visibly affected by the personal testimony, the human cost of corporate decisions suddenly unavoidable. Robert attempted to redirect. While Mr. Grant's situation is unfortunate, emotional appeals can't override our fiduciary duty to shareholders, especially in this crisis moment. Margaret Wilson spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of institutional history. Our duty extends beyond short-term stock price. Harrison Harrington built this company on principles that included community responsibility alongside profit. The current crisis stems precisely from abandoning those founding values. She fixed Robert with a penetrating stare. And speaking of the crisis, perhaps Mr. Harrington could explain why information about our confidential discussions regarding potential bankruptcy protections was leaked to the press during this meeting, information that conveniently accelerated market panic just before our vote. Robert's expression betrayed nothing but his slightly too long pause spoke volumes. I have no knowledge of any such leak. Walter Chen frowned, checking his own phone to confirm the news reports. This is disturbing. Market manipulation through selective leaks would be a serious breach of securities regulations. The revelation created precisely the doubt Eleanor needed. She seized the moment. Board members, you're not just voting on crisis management approach or temporary leadership today. You're deciding what Harrington Industries stands for in a defining moment. Will we be a company that takes responsibility for its actions and commits to making things right, or one that sacrifices its integrity to protect short-term financial interests? She paused, letting the question resonate. The path Robert proposes might seem safer today, but it leads to a company without a moral compass, one that will inevitably face another crisis and another, each one eroding what remains of our founding principles. Walter Chen surveyed the room, reading the shifting sentiment. I believe we're ready for a vote. The motion before us is to temporarily suspend Eleanor Harrington as CEO during the current crisis period, with Robert Harrington assuming interim leadership. All in favor? 7 hands rose, including Robert's and his closest allies. Opposed? 6 hands, including Margaret Wilson's and Walter Chen's own. Eleanor's heart sank. Despite everything, Robert had secured a narrow majority. Then Walter Chen spoke again. According to our bylaws, the CEO's removal even temporarily requires a two-thirds majority of the full board. The motion fails. He turned to Eleanor. Ms. Harrington remains CEO with full authority to manage this crisis according to her judgment. Robert's face flushed with barely contained fury. This isn't over, Walter. The shareholders will demand accountability when they see what happens to their investments under this approach. Perhaps, Walter replied calmly, but they'll judge us on the full outcome, not just tomorrow's stock price. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out in tense silence, the battle lines clearly drawn for future confrontations. Eleanor remained at the table, the victory feeling incomplete and fragile. Michael approached his expression a mixture of relief and concern. That was too close. It still might not be enough, Eleanor admitted. Robert will regroup, find another angle, and the remediation challenges remain enormous regardless of board politics. But you've won the right to address them honestly, Margaret reminded her, gathering her materials. That's no small achievement in corporate America. As they left the boardroom, Eleanor's phone rang. Her communications director again. We need your final approval on the statement. Media deadline in 20 minutes if we want to make tomorrow's news cycle. Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Send it out as drafted. Full disclosure, full commitment to remediation and health support, no evasion. She ended the call aware that she'd just committed her company and herself to a path with no retreat possible. Whatever came next, there would be no more hiding the truth about Oakwood. The following morning dawned with Harrington Industries dominating headlines again, but with a dramatically different tone. Harrington admits decades of toxic dumping, commits to full cleanup. The statement issued under Eleanor's name acknowledged the accuracy of the leaked documents, committed to comprehensive remediation, established a health fund for affected residents, and pledged cooperation with all regulatory investigations. Financial analysts predicted doom. The stock dropped another 12% at opening. Crisis management experts criticized the approach as corporate suicide. Yet by midday, something unexpected began happening. Environmental groups cautiously praised the transparency affected residents, expressed guarded optimism, and several ethical investment funds indicated interest in supporting a reformed Harrington Industries. Eleanor watched the unfolding coverage from Oakwood, where she'd arrived for the community meeting scheduled that evening. The school gymnasium had been transformed with rows of chairs, a presentation area, and information stations staffed by environmental experts and health professionals. Despite the crisis engulfing her company, she felt a strange calm, the certainty that comes from finally aligning actions with values, whatever the consequences. Michael found her reviewing remediation diagrams with the technical team. Quite the media firestorm you have created. Better to light it ourselves and let it consume us uncontrolled. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes had deepened. How's Sophie? Struggling with the attention. The local news wanted to interview her as the face of Oakwood, but I refused. Michael's protective instincts were evident in his tense posture. She's a child, not a symbol. Eleanor nodded, understanding his concern. The health support team is ready to discuss her specific treatment needs whenever you're comfortable. No publicity, no corporate PR angle, just getting her the best care possible. Before Michael could respond, a commotion near the gymnasium entrance drew their attention. Robert Harrington had arrived flanked by two men in expensive suits, likely lawyers or PR handlers. What is he doing here? Michael muttered, instinctively moving between Robert and Eleanor, creating a narrative most likely. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, preparing for confrontation. Let me handle this. She crossed the gymnasium, meeting Robert halfway. His appearance here in the community, his decisions had helped poison, displayed either remarkable courage or complete tone deafness. Bold move, showing up in person. Eleanor greeted him, keeping her voice low to avoid creating a scene. Robert's smile was thin and calculated. I'm still a Harrington executive. If the company is committing to this community, I should understand exactly what that entails. Or you're here to gather ammunition for your next board challenge. Eleanor didn't bother disguising her skepticism. These people have suffered enough without becoming pawns in corporate politics. Always assuming the worst about me. Robert glanced around the gymnasium, taking in the preparations. Impressive mobilization in 24 hours. Almost as if you'd been planning this response regardless of the board's decision. I believe in being prepared. Eleanor noticed community members beginning to arrive, casting curious, and sometimes hostile glances toward Robert. This isn't the place for executive confrontation. These people deserve respect, not corporate theater. Robert leaned closer, his voice dropping further. The special board committee is meeting tomorrow to review the financial impact of your statement. Early projections show potential losses exceeding $3 billion in market value. Your position remains precarious despite Walter's procedural maneuver yesterday. Is that a threat or a forecast? Consider it friendly intelligence from a family member who still doesn't want to see you destroy yourself completely. Something almost like genuine concern flickered across Robert's features. You've won this battle, Eleanor. Don't sacrifice yourself pursuing total victory. Before she could respond, Sophie appeared at Michael's side, tugging his hand and whispering something urgent. Michael nodded, then approached Eleanor. We need to start soon. People are getting restless. He acknowledged Robert with a curt nod, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure in the presence of someone he viewed as directly responsible for his daughter's suffering. Robert studied the interaction between them with calculated interest. Mr. Grant, I understand your daughter has been particularly affected by the contamination. Harrington Industries deeply regrets any health impacts experienced by community members. The rehearsed corporate statement landed like a slap. Michael's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Sophie stepped forward. Are you the man who made the water bad? Her question, asked with a child's direct simplicity, created an instant hush in their immediate vicinity. Robert looked genuinely startled by the direct address from this small person. That's a complicated situation involving many decisions over many years. Sophie considered this evasion with solemn eyes. My teacher says when you make a mistake, you should say sorry and fix it, not make excuses. The wisdom from this 7-year-old girl, delivered without malice or calculation, landed with devastating precision. Robert seemed momentarily at a loss for words, perhaps the first time Eleanor had ever witnessed such a thing. Your teacher sounds very wise. He finally managed, his corporate polish momentarily cracked. She is. She had to stop teaching because she got sick from the water, too. Sophie turned to her father. Can we start the meeting now? I want to show people my clean water project. As Michael led Sophie away, Robert watched them go with an unreadable expression. Remarkable child. I hope our health program serves her well. It will, Eleanor assured him, because it will be designed to actually help people, not just limit corporate liability. The community meeting began 30 minutes later, the gymnasium filled beyond capacity. Eleanor opened with a brief statement acknowledging the harm caused by Harrington Industries and personally apologizing for the company's actions past and present. No corporate speak, no legal hedging, just direct accountability. Michael followed with a technical presentation on the remediation plan, translating complex environmental processes into terms the community could understand. His unique position, both victim and now part of the solution, gave him credibility no corporate representative could match. The question period that followed was intense but productive. Residents expressed anger, fierce skepticism, and occasional hope. Eleanor and Michael answered honestly, acknowledging when they didn't have immediate answers and refusing to make promises they couldn't keep. Throughout the meeting, Eleanor noticed Robert observing from the back, saying nothing but watching everything with analytical precision. Was he gathering ammunition for the next board battle, or possibly reassessing his own position? Either way, his presence added an element of uncertainty to an already complex situation. As the formal meeting concluded and residents broke into smaller groups with technical experts, Sophie approached Eleanor with a carefully folded paper in hand. I made this for you, she said, offering the drawing with solemn ceremony. Eleanor accepted it, unfolding the paper to reveal a crayon illustration of Miller's Creek, not as it currently existed, but as Sophie imagined it could be. Clear blue water, children swimming, trees, and wildlife flourishing along green banks. It's beautiful, Sophie. Is this what you hope the creek will look like someday? Sophie nodded earnestly. Dad says it'll take a long time, but you're going to make the water clean again. I drew this so you wouldn't forget what we're working for. The simple statement, what we're working for, crystallized everything for Eleanor. Not stock prices or corporate reputation or even her own career, but this child's vision of a restored world. I won't forget, Eleanor promised, carefully refolding the drawing and placing it in her jacket pocket close to her heart. This is exactly what we're working for. As families gradually departed and the technical teams packed up their materials, Eleanor found herself standing beside Michael at the gymnasium doors, watching the Oakwood community disperse into the evening. People whose lives had been irrevocably altered by corporate decisions, yet who had shown remarkable resilience and even cautious hope. What happens tomorrow, Michael asked quietly, when the financial impact hits fully and the board reviews the situation? Eleanor watched as Sophie skipped ahead to their car, her energy seemingly unlimited despite the long evening. Tomorrow we keep working. The stock price will fluctuate, Robert will continue plotting, the board will debate, but the remediation continues regardless. Michael turned to her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Why risk everything? Your career, your family relationships, your financial security, for this? The question deserved complete honesty. Eleanor took a moment before answering, watching Sophie in the distance. Because someday I want to walk along that creek with Sophie and see it exactly as she drew it today. Because my grandfather taught me that a life spent accumulating power without purpose becomes hollow at its core. Because I finally understand that true legacy isn't built through quarterly earnings, but through the lives we touch and the world we leave behind. The simple truth hung between them, creating a moment of connection that transcended their different backgrounds and initial antagonism. Michael nodded slowly, a recognition in his eyes. Then we'd better make it happen. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor faced the consequences of her decision. The stock stabilized eventually, but remained significantly down. Several major shareholders pushed for her removal. Robert continued his campaign against her, though more cautiously after questions arose about his possible role in market manipulation through selective leaks. The remediation work began in earnest. A complex multi-year project that would cost hundreds of millions and require technological innovations Michael was uniquely positioned to develop. His patent for water filtration systems, once gathering dust, became the foundation for approaches that could potentially transform environmental cleanup beyond just Oakwood. Eleanor expanded her vision beyond the immediate crisis, initiating a comprehensive restructuring of Harrington Industries around sustainable practices and community responsibility. It wasn't just damage control, but a fundamental reimagining of what the company could become, one that honored her grandfather's original vision while adapting to modern challenges. Sophie returned to school when the building reopened after extensive testing and remediation. Her breathing improved gradually as the contamination levels decreased, though doctors warned some damage might be permanent. The health fund Eleanor established ensured she and other affected residents received specialized care, regardless of insurance limitations. The relationship between Eleanor and Michael evolved from professional necessity to genuine partnership to something neither could yet define. They worked together daily on the remediation efforts, his practical expertise complementing her strategic vision. They avoided public displays that might undermine his credibility with the community or fuel Robert's insinuations, but their growing connection was undeniable to those who knew them well. One evening, 6 months after the crisis began, they stood together at the edge of Miller's Creek, watching the first phase of cleanup near completion. The water ran clearer now, though much work remained. My grandfather wrote in his notebook that a business that poisons the well from which its community drinks has already failed regardless of what the balance sheet says, Eleanor said, breaking the contemplative silence. I didn't understand what he meant until I met you and Sophie. Michael looked at her, the setting sun casting golden light across her face. And what did he mean? That true success isn't measured in profits, but in purpose, in creating something that improves lives rather than damages them. Eleanor smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. We still have a long way to go, but for the first time, I believe we're on the right path. As they walked back toward the town, Eleanor carried Sophie's drawing in her pocket, a reminder of their shared goal and the vision guiding them forward. The journey ahead remained challenging with Robert's opposition, corporate inertia, and technical obstacles to overcome. But in choosing to face these challenges honestly, Eleanor had found something she hadn't expected. Not just professional purpose, but personal connection. The real work had only begun, but for perhaps the first time in generations, Harrington Industries was building a legacy worth leaving behind.